Wahad, Thin, Thalatha. We've been... It's Arabic. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm going to tell you something about receiving this course that I often do at the beginning of a course. And that is, it is a real disadvantage to your ability to take in the information if you think about your own projects or properties. I normally disappoint people at the beginning of a course by telling them this. It's actually an advantage to your ability to design your property if you don't think about it during a course. And it comes down to that statement, you know, think globally, act locally. To design well locally or even on your own site, you have to be able to think globally. You have to think about global phenomena. So I know it's almost impossible, and it's okay. You're going to ask us questions and things about your own properties. But if you can, think about anything else but your place. You have a certain amount of attachment and involvement, and you know you've already made commitments and mistakes, and it sort of puts a screen up in front of you that makes it hard to receive the information. So it's just a way to think while you're going through the course. Think about other stuff. Think about other properties anywhere else in the world, but your own. Well, that's what I'm actually going to advise you at the end. I'm going to say, don't design your own place first. Design someone else's place first. Design all your friends' places first. Your family. Design your family's places for free. In fact, your family are going to be the most challenging. I'm also going to tell you, don't go home and nag your family to death. Right? You can practice on them forever. Right? There is a phenomenon called a permaculture divorce, you know. Well, you take the course and she doesn't, or he takes the course and she doesn't, and you go home really enthusiastic, and you go this way and they go that way, and you never meet again. They end up selling real estate, and you end up, you know, locking up biosphere reserves, you know. Just try and stay very open-minded about the information as you're receiving it. And it will come together in this pattern. It is a great big body of information, and it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. I'm very much trying to sort of fill in the edge. Edge again. You know, when you do a jigsaw, you always do the edge first, yeah? Same thing, do the edge, right? In the end, the middle of the picture becomes very obvious, right? And we're trying to fill that in from the edge. It's the same when you learn to draw, you know. When you're at preschool, they tell you to draw the outside of the picture and then scribble in the middle. It's like that with design. The edges are so important. So stay with the edges and stay away from your own property for a little while and try and sort of just receive the information. And things like, you know, analogies about deserts and different things. Bill's talking about termites and huge things. What is this to do with me, right? And my situation where I live, it has an awful lot. There's an enormous amount of lessons in there. There are many times on anybody's property where you are short of water, you're in a desert type situation for periods of time, there's evaporation over rainfall. In deserts, you more or less have to think like a termite. Their strategies of survival and all those examples are classic design criteria for the way you more or less have to think in that situation. And you're often in that situation in a microcosm of time during the year. Right? And it will change your attitude to design. And you need to know all the different situations of the classic landscape profiles that we're going through. And we're still in those classic landscape profiles. We've gone through deserts. And we haven't really covered volcanoes, yeah? Volcanic landscapes?
Not yet.
Not really? We have talked about the fact that they're 64 degrees, yeah, the angle of repose. Islands or non-volcanic, non-island volcanic situations, you've still got that same angle. If they're very, very old volcanoes, like ours in Australia, Mount Warning, they're quite weathered away and there's only some remnants of these slopes. They'll still be there, those angles. But if you're if you're in recent volcanic country where there has been recent eruptions, be careful, it can be quite alkaline. It may look like a humid landscape and you would expect it to be acid with a lot of humidity and high rainfalls. But if there's recent ash deposits, the ash is alkali. And you can be quite surprised. I assumed Guatemala was an acid landscape. And we're working at St. Lucas near Lake Atilan. When we did a pH test, it was quite alkaline. Lovely looking soil, very dark, very deep. But alkaline because of the amount of recent ash deposits. So got quite surprised there. You have these quite steep slopes to deal with, and they're really, most of this needs to be some sort of very secure forested system if it's that steep. If you go up into the Andes in Ecuador and you see where 500 years of Spanish clearing of the landscape and overgrazing of that cleared ground has kept it out of forest, you see enormous erosion as these deep volcanic soils erode very easily. And the classic system of volcanic landscapes is one of the great sustainable systems in history, and it's the Hawaiian system, the Ohana system. You can even get posters from the Hawaiian Tourist Board showing rough schematics, they're not too badly done, of Ohana systems, traditional Hawaiian systems. And it was all around land settlement patterns, which often really helps sustainability. We're always designing around odd surveyed boundary patterns, but the Hawaiians, on their high volcanic islands, picked a spot where there was a streamline coming through, and the village owned land that was a wedge. They divided their village landscape up as wedges, long wedges, from the coast to high up in the mountain at the top of the stream flow, above the stream flow. And then they designed from top down a system that works really well in that landscape. And starting at the top, there was the forest of the gods. And that was never touched. There was certain sacrifices and things that went on up there, but there was nothing, the forestry ecology was not interfered with, right? It was sacred. And that's kind of interesting because they made sure there was always the trickle-down nutrient from the top. And then the top wedge of their land was their forest, their forestry. And that was very carefully managed, and it was only for very, very special reasons were any trees logged. Right? And they were house or canoe. Is canoe spelt like that? Yeah? I'm a bit dyslexic, so if I make spelling mistakes, you correct me, okay? When I write sweat potato, I mean sweet potato. Okay? Then, so they were only very special. It was a big meeting if there was a tree got to be logged out of that forest. So even more security. That was trickle-down nutrient again, kept pretty secure. Then there's a next wedge of land up here was productive forest or food forests. Probably not just food, but all sorts of productive products out of the forest. And then by that time there was some stream control, and the stream was taken off sideways to taro ponds and main crops. So you've got main crop gardens, mostly taro. You know taro? Big elephant ear. Yeah. You can't see that blue from there? I think that is my light blue. Okay. So main crop, mostly taro. Taro is a Hawaiian potato. People who are interested in self-sufficiency should really look very carefully at their main crops. It's quite easy to get all the fancy garden together, all your little bits of special bits of nutrition, different cabbages and spinaches and greens and a few fancy different things. A little bit of protein's quite easy as well, actually. The hard bit's getting a good carbohydrate, starchy main crop. Up in the subtropics or warmer parts of Australia, most of us would probably starve, I think, up there if we had to grow our own food. We still sort of think in a European way that our main crop would be potatoes, but it wouldn't be. As you get north of Brisbane, it gets harder and harder to get a decent crop of potatoes. And you find people all over the world are very sentimental about their main starch crop. So Hawaiian, Tongan, Samoans, very sentimental about taro and all the different varieties and tastes of taro. Europeans have taken on the potato from the Andes. In Brazil, it's cassava. And Central America, North America, it's corn. Asia, it's rice. You've got all these main crops, and that's often the most important part to get very stable. So this main crop was taro, and there was little fish in the ponds, and they actually produced little fish as protein food as well from these taro ponds. And they would grow an acre of mulch, often things like canna lily, arrowroot type canna lilies and succulent plants for an acre of taro. And it's even recorded they'd go up to 5 acres of mulch crop for 1 acre of taro crop. The taro would be grown in great big mulched ponds. They'd fill the pond up and then fill it up with mulch and make a sort of boggy, mulchy swamp and grow the taro in those boggy swamp mulch pits. Then we come on down and you've got vegetable gardens mixed, veggie mixtures, village here, village, then coconut grove, and foreshore plantings. And if it was a tsunami coast, there would be at least 5 rows of coconuts on the foreshore, interplanted with other foreshore species, and they had quite a tsunami belt. Just back from the high tide, the sand dune, or back from high tide mark. But they maintained the village behind the coconuts and behind the coastal planted trees, or the trees that were tolerant to coastal winds, in amongst the coconuts. In fact, that's all you need for tsunami. You just need a big belt of trees on the foreshore. There was very little damage in New Guinea in '99, where there was a foreshore planting of a lot of trees. In fact, when you went 150 meters, if you had 150 meters of tree belt, reasonably dense tree belt, there was no damage behind that. That's all you need. It takes all the impact out of it. All we had to do was go and talk to the people, and we got the information, and go and have a look. You see, the media all went and took pictures of the sensational damage. That's what they were interested in because it was dramatic, and that was made good news. But when you went and had a look at what was going on, we actually wanted to find areas that got hit in New Guinea by the tidal wave, by the tsunami, but didn't have much damage, and we wanted to know why. And it didn't take very long to see it. When you moved along from Sisano Lagoon up the coast, the wave hit just as strong there, and there was areas that had 100 meters of tree belt, and houses behind them weren't even knocked over. And then we spoke to survivors and said, well, how did you survive? And they said, well, we ran to the back of the tree grove, and especially the clumping bamboos that are on the coast there, and they held on. And because the tree belt's quite dense, and there's quite a complication of trees on the foreshore, the wave comes in, the impact gets dissipated between the trees, all the debris that is what normally kills people gets trapped up, and only fine mulch comes through. And there was a big bank of mulch about 3 meters high, fine mulch, on the leeward side of the tree belt. We photographed it, we have all this information. And there was a repeated survival story of people running to the inland side of the tree belt and hanging on to a tree and sliding up like a fishing float, like a sliding fishing float, and sliding back down again with 3 successive waves, because it didn't have a power, it was just filtering through. And it was carrying no destructive debris. It didn't have any tin roofs in it or anything like that. And you will notice in the Indonesian tsunami photographs, there are trees where the buildings are down, there are still trees and coconuts stood up. And if you look at some of the aerial footage, when they're flying over looking down from a helicopter, you will see the damages where there is no tree belts on the foreshore. And the Indian government picked that up and decided they were going to plant all sorts of trees, and a lot of trees that were also productive along the foreshores, and they were going to fund families to plant trees as memorial trees to people who had been lost in the tsunami. So that's a good link to the people who were lost, and then people look after those trees. It's like having traditions of planting trees when people get married, or when you have births, deaths, marriages, any sort of social event. But if you get given a mango tree for your, as a wedding gift, you try and keep it alive, right? And if everybody does that, right, then you start planting a lot of trees in a community, and you can even do it for Christmas. I mean, Christmas trees could be fruit trees, couldn't they? And then we could plant them and come back and see everybody else's food for us later on. But there are traditions in some cultures of wedding gifts being fruit trees, and newborn, when babies are born, fruit trees are given. And you get a lot of trees in the ground like that. Well, it was that sort of symbolism that was adopted by the Indian government. And Bill added from his research early days in Hawaii that they also had traditions of putting rows, at least 5 rows of coconut palms on the foreshore, because you don't want the tsunami to fire up this valley, because this is like a valley at the bottom with the streamline, and interplanted with other trees that will grow on the foreshore. The tropical citrus pomelo will grow right on the foreshore. It's the most tropical citrus. It will grow with its roots in the salt water. Casuarinas grow on the foreshore and fix nitrogen and phosphorus. So they're good fertile trees to add to the fertility of the foreshore there. Cashew will grow just a little bit back from the foreshore and add an extra benefit of production. There are quite a few clumping tropical bamboos that will grow there, and they're fantastic to get in behind a bamboo. Nothing will come through a bamboo, and it won't shift. It won't come out in an earthquake either. It is traditions in many places, if there's an earthquake, run to the bamboo clump and hold on. It won't go down in a big crack, and it won't blow over in a hurricane or a cyclone. It's got tensile strength. It bends to the wind, stands back up again. And so that's all part of the Ohana system. And then out here, there's a managed lagoon and a managed reef. And that's harvested. And the hole in the reef is made by the fresh water, makes the hole in the reef coming out of the streamline. So if you manage it correctly, you manage the entrance in and out of the lagoon. And then they harvested fish out here as well. But it was recorded they actually got more fish from their taro ponds than they got out of the lagoon and the ocean. So they were pretty productive little fish they had up here. And the crayfish and fish they got out in the ocean, the crayfish they got off the reefs, they never ate the big ones. Big ones went back. That's also standard tradition in a lot of cultures. If you want an endless supply of wild fish, don't eat the big ones. We just need to reverse our size limits, and we'll have fish forever. Little fish are in surplus. Little everything are in surplus. You can always eat the babies. You can't eat mum. Ask any cattle farmer. You can eat the baby cows forever, more or less. You can't eat the oldest cows and come downhill. You end up with no cows. And you especially can't do it with fish. A fish has 1 million eggs. Only about half a dozen of them get to breeding age. Each one of those has 1 million eggs. Little tiny fish of a species, you can throw them over your shoulder on the land. The land needs them more than the ocean. And in many places in the world now, that's happened. On the east coast, northeast coast of America, Newfoundland, they've reversed the lobster limits now. Crayfish, is it crayfish, Andrew, or lobster? Lobster. Newfoundland's never had so many lobster since they reversed the size limits. You've got to when they get to a certain size, you're not allowed to keep them. You've got to put them back. And you end up with endless amounts of lobster. Same with fish. We've got a trophy hunter mentality about stuff. You can't eat the breeders. So that's what they did. And the Ohana system is a great system, very stable. Got the most stable elements at the top, coming down the streamline, stability on the foreshore, production out on the reef, and village tucked in the right spot there. The gardens that need most attention in close to the village, getting a good water supply, main crop just a bit further out, food forest above, main structural forest above that. And you've got an ideal system coming down those steep slopes. And you've picked a streamlined position. So that's a great way to behave on those volcanic landscapes. You can.
Have they incorporated anything for cyclone proofing as well in that system?
Well, as far as I know, that's in behind this, the coconut grove, so that's their shelter. The village is never right on the foreshore. It's that bit back behind the foreshore planning.
Yeah, thinking more of the wind effect rather than the wave effect.
Yeah, well, I think most of the winds would be coming off the ocean onto these steep slopes. So I presume that's in their planning.
They also have the pigs up there in the forest.
The pigs
Yeah.
in the food forest, yeah, getting surplus. Yeah, cooney pigs probably. The little pig, not the big European pig. Kiribati, the slides we were showing before, Kiribati, they have a lot of small pigs, these little fat pigs. You can use that type of thinking if you want to fully develop volcanic type landscapes. You can look at that Ohana system and say, we've got to fit into something like that if we're getting onto those steep volcanic slopes. You can start to use those sort of ideas and incorporate segments of that into your design plans wherever you are in volcanic landscapes. Or you've got to come down off that steepness, right, and come into the valley, into the floors of the valleys. The other thing there is in volcanic landscapes is there's types of lava. If it's black glass, solid rock, there's nothing you can do with it. You get these sheets of melted rock. It's 100% runoff. It's literally like glass, so you can catch that runoff and you can do things with that. It's literally like a roof. If it's pumice, it's very much like the caliche that you get on coral reefs, right, or the dense layers that you get in the tropical erosion of soils. And you can work in the pumice. You can knock holes in it, fill it up with mulch, glee it up, get trees growing in those mulch holes. The tree roots will help break up the pumice. Right? It's porous. The humic acid in the mulch will break it down a bit further. It's not impossible to work in any of those porous type, in the coral, in the caliche, in the kangao that results after all the tropical soil and topsoil has been eroded. It is recoverable. There is something you can do. And the same with pumice. You can work with that. Bill started to touch on high islands. Generally, high islands, mostly granite or basalt, are quite rich landscapes. And everything you can do on the humid landscape, usually you can do on the high islands. You've got a moderated climate if the island's not so big. There's some moderation of climate. So it's more or less the same as the humid landscape with the advantage of the coastal input. But be careful. Prevailing winds will often make one side of the island humid and one side of the island arid. And they can be distinctly different. So the humid side upwind will gather all the rain, and the leeward side will often be in a rain shadow. So you'll imagine you're going to a tropical island, and then it's got these lovely landscape features. It's not necessarily volcanic. It's not a coral atoll. But you may have to look at, okay, what is the prevailing wind and what are the weather patterns? And let's just prepare ourselves, because we can be landing on, or we can be working on the arid side, and it might not be what we expect. Otherwise, everything that works on the humid landscape with the key line, key point, starting off in the high point in the landscape, the key point coming down and planning things out, right down to coastal work with lagoons, similar to the volcanic system there, of the Ohana system. You're going to have cyclones. You may have the two tsunamis. If they are volcanic, there could be lava flows here. Not much you can do about that. Get out the way quick. Cinder flow, all those sort of things. I think we covered low islands pretty well. They're you're very limited on the low island. On those coral islands, you really are limited. There's a lot of work we can do out there. There's a lot of tourist resorts and things on low islands causing great problems. Nobody's thinking sustainably. There's real disasters on some of the islands happening right now. Kiribati was a real shock to me. I thought I was going to paradise to work in Kiribati, and it was a nightmare in paradise. They have some real medical problems and real sanitation problems and a huge amount of overpopulation on one island just because of a little bit of industry. 80,000 cans of beer drunk every weekend, all Australian beer. No landfill systems, no recycling systems. The lagoon's the dumping ground for most of the garbage. They're building up land with garbage and coral boulder walls encompassing garbage and then filling over the top. You know, there was 19 septic tanks on the island. They were all the foreign embassies. The hospital was pumping the sewerage out off the side of the island, including all the old medical drugs. The tradition of most people using the beach as a toilet at a lowish tide was still happening. There's 50,000 people on an island that's only 12 kilometres long, and it's only 500 metres wide at the widest point. A really high occurrence of, and I think it's one of the highest in the world of intestinal gastroenteritis in children because they're swimming in the lagoon, which has got an enormous amount of sewage floating around in it. It's just one nightmare after another, and there are set rules to how you behave, and it is all around that lens. If you pollute that lens, you're in big trouble. If you pump that lens too heavily, the salt water comes into the lens and the island dies. It's all around working with that lens, and you can get things going really well, but you are stuck. It's easy design work. It's very, very easy design work because you're limited by the criteria of the island. This is the only way you can do it. And foreshore plannings are crucial on low islands because there's often bimodal winds, so the wind blows one way and the other way. So your foreshore plannings have to be the trees that are resistant to salt winds, often the waxy leaf trees. And then things start to work quite well. Coasts are a particular landscape to themselves, a landscape profile. Coasts always need frontline windbreaks and salt-resistant trees. Trees that are resistant to sandblast and thick fibrous barks. The beach, there's a lot of work on the coasts here in Australia. Most of us live on the beach or live near the coast, most of the population. So if you're doing suburban work, you're often working in coastal suburbs that are sitting on top of sand dunes. It may not look like it anymore. They dig down a little way and you're into sand quite quickly. The beach is a little bit like a desert in that it's alkaline. Most of the sands are alkaline. You need to add flowers of sulfur or some type of sulfur to quickly adjust it to a more acid pH. You need to seal the sand so that you kind of glee the surface a little bit. Deep mulches work, but they tend to get eaten into the sand very quickly on beaches. So you need to stick up the surface, often starting gardens off with newspaper and cardboard, thick layers of newspaper and cardboard. Under mulch works good to try and sort of make the surface less porous and sucking away. It sort of sucks out your nutrients very quickly. Deep sawdust footpaths work really well in sands, beach sands, because normally they're a little bit acid. You have to be careful using deep sawdust footpaths in gardens because they're a little bit acid, but in beach sands, that acidity is a benefit to the alkalinity. It neutralizes things a little bit. Even the system of working in sand dunes in deserts works the same by planting in woven baskets or cardboard boxes sunk into the sand. Flowers of sulfur is the most common thing that you use to correct alkalinity. If you're a pH test, we usually tell you, if you buy a pH tester, they usually tell you for each degree of alkalinity how much flowers of sulfur per square meter or per acre you have to put on to bring it up 1 point or bring it down 1 point from alkaline to a bit more acid or closer to neutral. Looks like yellow custard powder. But because the sawdust becomes waterlogged and airless, it goes anaerobic, and you get a kind of acid condition that leaches into your alkaline, sandy gardens around. One of the worst conditions I worked in, or one of the most difficult conditions of beach sand I worked in, was up at Noosa, Sunshine Coast, Sunshine Beach School is on. One of my students decided to put in a school garden at Sunshine Beach School, and Darryl Fry, he had 2 daughters going to the school. After he took his course, he thought he'd put in this garden for the school and educate the kids about permaculture. And the teachers were really in favour of this garden because they gave him the kids who disbehaved in class. 1 day a week he'd go in and garden there. And he put this great garden in, but this garden and this whole school was sitting on white silica sand. The Noosa area there is famous for this really white sand, and it's nothing but pure white silica. It's quite famous. There's areas that mine it and use it in the building industry. And we got the school gardener on side, and he had a chipper, and we chipped all the school prunings. We introduced mulch into the gardens. We even put an article in the newsletter, and we got all the parents who had gardening businesses, instead of taking all their garden prunings and lawn mowing prunings to the dump, they dumped them at our school garden, and we had this massive amount of organic matter. It was probably 1 metre deep and 20 metres by 20 metres that were continuously added to the garden. And it slowly, well, not slowly, but quite quickly ate this mulch. But we still produced a good garden, and there were some difficulties around it. And we had a great success because it was only 1 day a week that Darryl would go in, and from every class in the school, teachers could choose children to go and work in our garden. And we developed lessons for these children that involved every single lesson they took in the school. We could get into the garden. Even, you know, mathematics and economy. We produced lettuces and salt, and they went into the tuck shop, and they actually made sandwiches from some of our tomatoes and different things. And we got, you know, a certain amount of income from that, and we got a maths lesson, an economy lesson out of it, and science lessons, and all kinds of stuff. And these kids they were giving us were the worst kids, the kids who wouldn't pay attention or are naughty in the school. And the teachers reported to us that coming to the garden improved their behaviour over a period of time. These kids were going back into the classroom, and they were better behaved. And they would actually, they wanted Darryl to write a report on this. And these kids actually protected the garden at tea breaks, right, and lunch breaks. They were often the sort of tough kids, and they wouldn't let the other kids trash the garden. They wouldn't let them eat out of it either, actually. Right? And they were eating quite a lot. We used to let them eat out of the garden, so they were eating absolutely fresh food. They were eating raw food straight out of the garden, which was probably doing them a bit of good as well, absolutely fresh enzymes. And Darryl got to write a report to the Education Department of Queensland about this, and they actually employed him as an assistant teacher so that he could report at a conference on the effects of this garden. So this was all going very well, and we're in the second year, and we noticed for the second time at the summer holiday time, when none of the kids were there, when we came back after the 6 weeks of summer holiday, the garden had dramatically failed because there was very little attention. You're at the really hot time of the year, and there was not so much water in the school gardener wasn't there. Daryl wasn't attending the garden. And we always had, in the second year, the first year it happened, the second year it happened as well, we had to do this great big recovery of the garden. And when you went in and had a look what was going on, the mulch had depleted over that time. And when you tried watering, the silica sand was getting so hot, it was literally boiling the plants at the roots. There was this horrible effect of this white silica sand, and it was so hungry, it was eating enormous amounts of mulch. It was just sucking it into the sand dune. So we really wanted this garden to stay alive. So you read all the books, and it says if you really have a problem with sand, if you really want to make a complete recovery or really make a dramatic effect, introduce clay. Bring clay in to a garden. Because clay is the opposite to sand. It's incredibly fine. It's the finest of materials. And incorporate it into the sand. So you've got the coarsest of materials, sand, with the finest of materials. So we decided to bite the bullet and try and do this. So we potted up what we could out of the garden, even some of the trees that we'd got in. We left some in position. We stripped all the mulch off, and there was a lovely black layer underneath the mulch on top of the white sand, and we got down into the discoloured sand and then eventually the white sand, stripped it all off the garden, and we got 7 tons of clay. There was some building site that wanted to get rid of it. We didn't have to pay for it. Nobody wanted it. And they dumped this yellowy brown 7 tons of clay next to our garden, and we wheelbarrowed it in to the garden beds and tried mixing it with the white sand, which is a nightmare when you try and do it. It's really hard to do. It doesn't want to mix. We couldn't dry it out and powder it in. It was already wet and there wasn't enough time. We tried sort of rolling it into the white sand and it all got really messy. It was a horrible job. Well, we just did the best we could. Great big lumps of clay and stuff all stuck up with sand, and stuck it all over and tried to sort of dig it in as best we could. And then we put the black discoloured sand back on that had quite a lot of humus and mulch additions to it, and we put the mulch back on, and then we added more mulch on top of that and tried to get a good job out of it, and added the best stuff we could and put the garden back together. It was about 4 months later I got a phone call from Daryl. He said, "Come and have a look at the garden. You won't believe it." And I went along. He said, "Dig down through the mulch." And when we dug down through the mulch, there was about well over, nearly half a metre, I'd say, getting close to half a metre, 350 mil, 400 mil, of really good, dark, sort of half sandy, half clayey, high humus, very interesting looking soil. So we didn't mix the sand and the clay very well, but all the life over the 2 years of gardening there that was in the mulch and in amongst the sand had moved into the minerals of the clay and incorporated the clay and the sand together into this quite interesting cap of soil sitting on top of the sand dune. And now, the following year, the garden didn't need anywhere near the same amount of mulch. It held on to its mulch, it held on to its water, and it survived the next summer holiday really quite well. So it was this incorporation of clay into the sand, and the mixing of it was done by the life in the soil, or the life introduced into the sand, should I say, by all the mulch and organic matter and manures that we'd put in over those 2 years. It was a life mixing process. It wasn't us that did it. And people used to come and say, wow, you've created such a great soil. And I often feel like this. You kind of feel guilty. We didn't really do that. We had a hell of a job mixing that clay. We couldn't really mix the clay with the sand. The life in the soil did it. We didn't do most of the work. We did a very small, we put the elements together. It's the same when you put a system together. You put a good design together on a blank piece of land, hasn't got much on it. You put a system in, you place all the elements, and this amazing thing happens. The better a designer you are, the better the system works for you, the less you do over time. People come along 2 or 3 years later and you've got this great big system up and all sorts of diversity happening. And hopefully this will happen to you. And people say, wow, you've done a lot of work. And you really feel quite guilty because you haven't. You placed a lot of things in the right order together and they did it. That's how you know a design's working. The system works very hard. The system diversifies itself. The system creates the fertility. The system creates itself. It evolves out. You just steer it a little bit. You do quite a lot of placement to begin with, and then it takes off, and you kind of stand back and watch it happen. And you steer it a bit this way and that way, and you make a few additions, and you make a few adjustments. And you do less over time as it evolves. So you have to let the system demonstrate its evolutions. Okay, so wetlands. These are very interesting places and often quite abused and drained and filled in. Marshes and wetlands are very rich places, and there's all sorts of production comes out of marshes. They're just not very hospitable places because it's a real combination of water and land together, making this swampy, muddy, hard to work with situation. But when you intensify the water a little bit by deepening channels, you end up with material that you're excavating that intensifies the land. And when you start to intensify the land, you end up with a lot of edges between water and land. And after a little bit of thinking about where you're going by deepening water and raising the land, which starts to sound like a canal subdivision, which is kind of a similar pattern, you end up with something that is the most productive agriculture ever recorded. The most productive, sustainable agriculture ever recorded is the Chinampa system. The classic Chinampas recorded in history are in Central America, in Mexico, but you get the same systems through Asia, and I've come across them myself in Vietnam, just outside Ho Chi Minh City. I wandered down a lane and came across a Chinampa system of types. We had an interesting time working over the Chinampas at Tagari Farm and researching what's possible. It's an enormously complicated system of Chinampa, incredibly complicated. A lot of our systems are. Even something as simple as a chicken tractor can be a very lengthy thing to research and document, has an enormous amount of variables. A Chinampa is probably endlessly variable. But the classic Chinampas documented in history were around Mexico City. And when the Spanish arrived in Mexico City to conquer the Mexicans, they documented it. And they documented that 1 million people were living in Mexico City, and they were fed by Chinampas that went through the whole city and surrounded the city. So 1 million people were fed by this really intense, highly productive per square meter, very sustainable system. And they didn't have cameras at those times, but they had artists traveling with them who painted the Chinampa systems. And so we got a good idea of what they looked like. And there are many types, but your standard Chinampa system is 50% land and 50% water, more or less. And we've got productive water and productive land and lots of edges in between. But the edges don't stop there. They go vertically, horizontally, and pattern out across the landscape. And it's the multiple edges that obviously make it very productive. So it's a good lesson in why edges are so important to analyze why a Chinampa system is so productive. But let's draw up one version. Right. You've got, let's say, crops on either side of this canal. So you've got crops, vegetable crops or something. You might have tree crops on this side of this canal. And then vegetable crops on that side. And then tree crops again over here. So half the land strip could be tree crops, half could be vegetable crops. They can be either or both. Then you get plants that grow right off the edge that like wet conditions. They can be on either any of the banks. You can get fish in the water, so you can get different fish in here. You could also have crustaceans as part of a yield. You could also have different mollusks, freshwater mussels or shellfish. You could have ducks. You can have emergent plants coming out of the water, like water chestnut. To do that, probably best to put a ledge in here of some type. You can have floating water plants. Some may be even edible. In North America, you have trapa, floating water chestnut. Or they could be just mulch plants. And a lot of the mulch plants that we demonize as weeds have roots that filter out suspended nutrient in the water, so they're really good mulch. They don't have any seeds that, or weed, they don't have any seeds that grow on the land, so there's no weed effect from putting them up there on the land. And azolla, one of the famous little floating water ferns, actually has a nitrogen fixing ability, a little pocket on its on this fern that holds nitrogen, and that's a nitrogen-rich fertilizer. So these could be put into the system and harvested as mulch. Not so much where the trees are, where it might be shady. We can trellis over the top of this, and they traditionally were trellised, different types of trellises, like this, tied together. And we can grow crops, climbing crops over the top. Most of your climbing vines, fruiting vines, originate on water's edge. It's the only place where there was enough light in natural systems and vertical edge next to the water. So these in their original habitat, vines that had great big fruits and produced crops that we domesticated, grapes and passion fruit, were water edge plants originally. So, and you could grow annual plants as well, like bean crops or cucurbite crops over the water too. By boat, and traditionally you did harvest by boat, which is great because you don't. It's much easier to put your half a ton in a boat and pull it along. You can't put half a ton in a wheelbarrow, and there's a set limit to what you can push as one man, and that's why they don't make bigger wheelbarrows. I often think a lot about hand tools, and there are these set sizes. Why don't we make bigger shovels? Well, although there are some men a little bit stronger than others, generally we're all about the same. So, you know, hand tools tend to standardize, like wheelbarrows, you know, they're only set size. You make a double-sized wheelbarrow, you can't fill it up because you can't pick it up and push it. But you can in a boat because the water's in a canoe or a punt. Yeah, you can put tons in there and pull yourself along. So you can pull and pick, pull, pick, munch, pull, pick, you know, and, you know, grab a bit off the bank as you go. That makes that a very big duck, doesn't it? But still. We've got swans on here. Or it's a little person, right?
That would only be 2-3 meters wide.
They vary in size. They go down. There are scales of chinampas, obviously. We found it very convenient in Australia to have a 6-meter span here and a 6 meters of land, 6 meters of water. Why? Because 50 mil polypipe, black polypipe, fits over a 6-meter span very well. You stick in a star picket, it's just, permaculture is an appropriate system to now, right? You've got to remember that, right? So if you can recycle something that's appropriate now where you are, that's permaculture. It doesn't matter that it's not traditional. You got it now, use it now, it's appropriate now. We'll sort something out later. We're not going to get to utopia tomorrow, okay? But we can get to a very appropriate situation right now. Recycling what's available to you at this moment is the way to do it. We might not traditionally make polypipe, but right now you can get 50 millimeter irrigation pipe for $1 a meter. And you often have 6 meters of scrap lying around. And a 6-meter span is the largest arc you can do before it collapses, stuck onto 2 star pickets of 50 millimeter or 2-inch irrigation pipe. Forms a perfect arch. If you go 7 meters, it bends down in the middle. It goes floppy. You can go smaller. You can't go too small. You've got to go to a smaller pipe. 1-inch pipe fits over a tomato stake. Makes a nice hoop. The 6 meters gives you that polypipe stretch, and so you've got your 7.5 meters of polypipe or something. Or you can go straight up and down. Or what I've always wanted to do, and I never quite got to it, I'll be on a property long enough with a chinampa sometime, hopefully, is stick in mulberry cuttings, ram in mulberry cuttings here. Right. It's interesting to find trees that are very useful that grow from cuttings. You can establish big cuttings fast. So, especially the legumes. I'm a bit of a legume freak, so I'm always looking at the support species. The legumes that grow from cuttings are interesting. But mulberries are interesting. They grow from cuttings. And you can prune mulberries to do whatever you like. So you don't let your mulberry grow branches. You make him grow a great big long whip, just one shoot. If you prune all the branches off, he'll put all his effort into growing one great big long branch. And then you do the same the other side, and they will pleach. That's when you graft one tree to another tree. You see pleached fences in Europe, where they grow these great big crisscrosses and fancy just for aesthetics. So we could grow our mulberry over and pleach it to the mulberry on the other side. Yeah? Now we can let it grow side branches and pleach it to the next one down the row. Right? So we can put this net of mulberry across the Chinampa. And grapes grow on mulberries very well. They're a companion. So I've always wanted to do this grape mulberry pleached trellis over a Chinampa, just to be totally utopian about the whole thing. Right? Sorry? Right. But there are many things we could do thinking about this with the trellis. What you can also do is you can change the level of the water in a lot of Chinampas. You need to be able to control the water. It's handy to be able to drop and rise the water. Individually or separately is good, or across the whole system. Because you can flood up this floating water plant onto the land and flood the land before you crop plant it, if you like. And then you can drop the water right down and harvest your crayfish or your fish. Handy to be able to drop your fish pond down to a very small level and get in there and get your fish out. Also, you can drop it right down, because with all this life going on in a concentrated area, you're going to get a whole load of silt down here, right, that was traditionally harvested, and you can put that back up on the land with all your floating water weed. Right, nice silty mud up there, lots of detritus matter, lots of fish manure and all sorts of things, manure, rotten bits of vegetation, silts, with your mulch, and you're increasing the fertility on again. You can fence, include a fence on part of this trellis here on the lower half, and fence the ducks into the water. So you're concentrating your ducks on the water, and then you can concentrate them on the next one, and then move them off. If you look down on this, I draw a simple one. They can be quite complicated. Don't think they have to be this simple. Just say you had just some straightforward canal ponds like that. Here are your long Chinampa ponds. If you fence, put one little fence there and one little fence there, you can hold chickens on there. Chickens don't swim. You can't do that with the ducks, they'll swim over. But you can easily then, with just some small fencing, right, you can cycle chickens across the land base. Right? If you start doing this, right, you can put ducks onto this system on the actual water or onto the land, because they're also fenced on the land when you put them on there. Right? So we actually tracted pigs across one of these for a while in a pig tractor, a caged pig tractor along the system. There are enormous amounts of variations you can do. It's quite endless. It doesn't have to be a straight line system. There can be canals like this, if you like. There can even be islands in the system. It doesn't really matter. There can be dams. If you have dams, you build a dam wall on a valley that's flat at the back. Here's your dam wall here. Say a spillway going over here. And the back of the dam's quite shallow. Where the shallow slope comes in the back and the water would flood up, you can design this sort of system. And this acts like a chinampa. Right, here's your land. And you can even fence your fish in if you like, put a fish fence across there, put a chicken fence across here. There are all kinds of variations on that. Does that look like a big foot or something? Yeah. That's my footprint. I've seen dams put in that the tailback has been turned into a chinampa like this. So the shallow valley coming into the dam has turned into a chinampa by setting the levels right. And put one in like this at the Shannon. We had islands going across. We had two valleys coming in, and we had kind of chinampas going across like this at the back of the dam. Almost looked like a ladder from up in the air. And that streamline came in like this and naturally split, and that we flooded up behind the back of the dam and got set our level so it created a set of islands which worked as a chinampa. We just put a bridge across and worked out a chinampa type system. So you have lots of horizontal edge looking down on it. Then you have trees, you could have understories, you could have land crops, edge crops, emergent crops, trellis crops, fish, crayfish, shellfish, waterfowl, chickens on the ground, on the land base, floating water plants for fertility, and for mulch production. And it's all of those edges that made it the most productive system ever documented per square metre, and completely sustainable as long as you manage it a bit. If you don't, it probably goes into quite a wild, but still very productive and diverse natural system. We had one. I had one to play with, so I can tell you. And I put research students on there, and I felt sorry for them. It just mind-blowing to try and work out what is going on. I mean, you just need years and years and years of experience. You need many generations to understand what may happen. Even, like I say, even a chicken tractor system, where I had a Japanese student, Masako, spent 2 years with us at the Research Institute, and mainly what she did was research quite a diverse 7-garden chicken tractor. And it was incredible what she got to write down. She wrote a book. And when you started to look in, there was an enormous amount of variables involved. How many chickens? How old are the chickens? How wet is it? How much mulch is it? What time of year is it? Which crops are you putting in there? How old are the trees that go around it? How tall is the fence? How large is the garden? And it's just the beginning. You know, it's very easy to write it down in a book. This is where experiential knowledge we have to build. It'd be great if you could go down the road and say, oh, well, this guy who's 10th generation permaculture chicken tractor expert, he's going to tell you everything. Well, he ain't there. It's you we're talking about that's going to start that. It's a lot easier now. When I finished my course in 1983, I couldn't even go out and find a swale. You can fast track. I'm fast tracking students now, unbelievably fast. It's scaring me, getting out there in all sorts of trouble. Yeah, some. Even lost a couple to malaria. Watch out for cerebral malaria. You only got 2 days to get to hospital. But people are very brave. They get out there and really try and help people. You know, they get out in really difficult situations. They take it on. But with this, we had one that, okay, so the water came in. We were feeding from a large dam that was overflowing because we had loads and loads of swales uphill, stacked up water. One of our main dams, the Shalimar, with the island Tasmania in it. All right. It was overflowing, 3 2-inch pipes 24 hours a day. One of the 2-inch pipes went through a nice little canal and through a couple of taro ponds and into a little round dam, and then eventually overflowed in here. And that was into one of these. There were 7 of these, so it came in here. All right. And then it was overflowing here. And all that was an overflow pipe, right? And it had an elbow on it, which was just a 4-inch pipe, a down pipe off a gutter, with a right angle elbow on it that wasn't glued on. So if you wanted it to flood, you'd turn the elbow up like that. And all of them flooded. Simple, you just have an unglued right angle elbow and turn it round. It's not rocket science. And the other thing you can do is we had lots of these. You know, 4-inch pipe like this, like plumbing pipe, comes down off your gutter, plastic pipe. You get, just fish around, people are always throwing away flower pots. You can get thousands of them, you know, plastic flower pot. Find a plastic flower pot that roughly fits up the end, yeah? Doesn't work because it's got holes in it. Right. So stick a plastic bag over it, right, and jam it up the end of the pipe. Pipe's blocked. Whatever you've got up the other end is going to not come out and start flooding. We had lots of simple systems like that. It wasn't anything. You could put a tap on it or a gate valve if you wanted, but we just had plastic pipes rammed up the... Something that simple floods that all back. It's not high pressure, it's low pressure. It's just like a rising tide. Right? And then if we wanted to dry them out, you know, we'd stop this and send this another way. It was another elbow, and the water went this way instead. Right? And there was a low pressure, low pipe on here that we could open up and it would start draining them all. And you've got to design all that in, that's all. But it's quite low-tech stuff. It's got pipes and elbows and turn something, send the water this way. Once you get lower down in the system, you can't put these high up in the system. You've got to stack your water up high, get surplus water draining out of your big landscape sponge, and then you've got multiple choices what you can do with it. You can send it this way, you can send it that way, you can soak it in here, you can soak it in there. If we blocked this and kept flooding it, the whole lot would flood, and it'd actually go out this way. Flood out over the whole landscape this way. It was set up to gently tilt back this way. It was very, very neat the way it was all done. That was quite a simple chinampa. And they come a lot more complicated than that.
You can set this up onto a step, like onto a slope, and you step your ponds down. Would that work?
I've never seen them step down a bank, but I don't see that it's not possible. You just have to make sure you've got them all sealed up right. They seem to work well because the water sort of floods through. There's obviously a high water table in underneath this land base as well. There's a certain amount of soakage coming in like this. If you can't, then you know you're going to have to with the mollusks. You're going to have to drag them out somehow. You're going to have to actually put some kind of basket in and drag it through and pull them out. They're easy when you drain it. You know, they're crawling around on the mud. They're moving around on the mud. They were easy when we drained our fish ponds. In fact, we had freshwater mussels because we put they were put in the dams at the top of the whole property, 148 acres. The top dam had mussels, and they came through all the irrigation systems. In fact, they blocked our bloody filters up. Millions of little mussels came through every single dam. And one of my students did a survey on those, and over 48 dams, we had 10 tons of mussels. It was just free. They were just there. They'd spread themselves through the whole irrigation system. All the gravity pipes had baby mussels come through at some time because of all the connections between dams. And we could flood, you know, we could drain this one off and not drain the others, or drain individual ponds without draining the others, and we could flood individual ponds. So you need to set up that variable. If you can't get your crayfish out, there's a really neat way to get your crayfish out. Fish are a lot easier if you can drop the level and you can get them out of the shallower water. They're all concentrated. But if you can't, these are not very wide. That makes them very easy to net. You get problems with fish ponds when you get over 24 meters wide. It starts getting very hard to net it. You're starting getting into a wildlife dam or a wild fish dam. When you get in that size, it's something you've got to go and literally fish them out or attract them to one spot. If you can, if you can feed regularly here, fish, like all of your animals, are very habitual. You be regular with them, they'll turn up. You can feed here, and you'll get a feeding frenzy going on after a while. They'll get used to you feeding there, and then you can shut them in. There are different systems. If you've got a gating system, just shut them down, and you've got them all in that there. Now you can net them out of there, or a certain amount of them.
Can you incorporate grey water into that too?
Into here, or
It's just grey water. Is it a good place to put your grey water?
no, you'd want to clean it up first, in case, you know, it depends how grey the water was, but generally you'd want to put it through some biological filter first. Without getting into aquaculture, we're talking about the possibilities of working in marshlands, wetlands, swampy type conditions. This is very cheap to do if you're generally looking at these systems. These are the Melaleuca swamps of the coast, up the east coast of Australia. A lot of country that's been put into sugarcane. Would convert into, if it wasn't for the residual toxicity. Our sugarcane country of the subtropics and tropics will ideally convert into this and way outproduce sugarcane. But you've got a bit of residual toxicity to deal with. Over time you'd clean it up, but the toxins are a bit heavy in the sugar. But that type of country was Melaleuca swamp before it was sugarcane. And you just put in a swamp dozer. If you want to do big vague systems like this, you put in a swamp dozer and with wide tracks, and what you pull out, you push up on the land, you intensify the land and intensify the water, and you've got, just quickly, if you want to get these out, there's a great way of getting these out. You just, you introduce water in one spot, right? Let the level go down as low as you can, then introduce water in one spot, down a little ramp. So you make a little thing like a little ramp with a bucket on the high end, and one of those outdoor carpets, and the water just runs down the ramp into the water, and it's running over this little ramp. And the crayfish that are impounded in here think there's a little stream or a flood coming in, and they walk up the ramp and they fall in the bucket. Especially if you can lower the level a little bit, so they think there's a bit of a drought on, and that where the water's coming down the ramp, they literally walk up because they'll try and migrate to the flow of water. And many crayfish farmers play that trick. They can probably vary. I've seen them really shallow, but probably 1.5 meters is a good productive depth. 2 meters is getting deep. 3 meters is probably a bit wasteful. But I'm not saying that 3 meters, there aren't situations where 3 meters might work for some specific reason. Fish generally For productivity of fish, 1.5 to 2 meters is all you need. After that, it's kind of wasted water.
Just the ponds, like if you give the pond, you use clay or what do you use?
Wherever possible, clay, yeah, and clay lined
How thick the layer?
of clay.
Yeah, you're gonna have the system with the drain and stuff.
Generally, it's a rule that 1 meter of clay, 1 meter thick of clay, gives you an absolutely secure dam. 1 meter to half a meter of clay. But you've got that much life and that much detritus matter in this system, it will seal itself as you work it. It will glee itself with this much life around it. You know, the manure from all the different animals, fish and other elements will glee itself. But really these systems need to have an input of water. You need to set it up below your main sources so as an input of water. Yeah. Deep breath. 1, 2, 3.